Okay, let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to today's Snack and Learn webinar. I will just mention quickly the housekeeping items. The presentation slides are available to download at the top right in the Materials tab. You can find the PDF there. And also next to it, there is the question box where you can log your questions, and we will address these at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. So I will hand it over to the team to start the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to today's Snack and Learn about our flood alert system in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Hi, I'm Kristen Stoudt, an Assistant Water Resources Engineer. I've been with WSP for a little over a year. Our team works out of the Bluebell, Pennsylvania office and are a part of Earth and Environment. The project team who made important contributions to the project are Gaz, Taylor, Brad, and John. Presenting to me today with me is Kristen Hayes.
Hi everybody, I'm Kristen. I'm an Associate Water Resources Engineer out of the Bluebell, Pennsylvania office, and I've been with WSP for a little over 2 years now, and I'm excited to be presenting on the work that we've done in Williamsport.
To go over the agenda today, we're going to go over the project introduction and background, the client challenge, site analysis, historic resources, preliminary alternative analysis, innovative solution, project continuation, conclusion, and then have time at the end for some questions and answers.
So to start, I'm going to give a little bit of background information. This project takes place within the city of Williamsport, which is located within the Susquehanna River Valley of central Pennsylvania in the United States. Williamsport is a small city within a rural area of the state and has a population of about 28,000 people. The city is susceptible to flooding from a variety of sources, and it's protected by levees along Lycoming Creek, which is on the west side of the city, Miller's Run on the east side of the city, and then the West Branch Susquehanna River along the south side of the city. WSP has a long-standing relationship with the city of Williamsport, as we've been working with them to recertify their levee system for over a decade. And this figure is from the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer Map, and I included it just to show the extent of flood risks within the city. The striped orange hatching shows the areas that are protected from flooding by the levee system, but for this project, our area of interest is along Grafius Run, which is a two-branch stream that flows from the north of the city into the underground storm sewer system. The city contracted with WSP to develop flood mitigation techniques to alleviate flooding from Grafius Run. And in this presentation, we're going to discuss how our design evolved from the conceptual design of floodwater detention basins to the final implemented design of real-time flood alert sensors. The services WSP provided the client include hydrologic and hydraulic analysis, conceptual designs, preliminary permitting analysis, and sensor site selection and installation. So Grafius Run poses a challenge to the city due to continual flash flooding. This flash flooding often occurs where the stream enters the inlets to the storm sewer system, and this is due to debris blockages that reduce the capacity of these inlets. These debris blockages can cause the stream to overtop its banks and flood nearby roads, residences, and businesses, putting lives and property at risk. This picture on the right shows one of the city's employees using equipment to remove debris from the inlet before flooding occurs. And this picture was actually taken after project implementation, which allowed the city to be notified of potential flooding before it happens, so that they can be deployed to the inlet to remove the debris. And in addition to the current flooding experienced, future flooding impacts are only expected to worsen without intervention. During a past project for the city, WSP completed a hydrologic analysis using nearby stream gauge data with 100 plus years of record to determine the 100-year 50% confidence interval flows. And the results of this analysis show that the 100-year flows have increased by approximately 7.5% since FEMA's flood insurance study was released. And with climate change expected to cause increased precipitation in the region, Not only did we have to design a solution that would mitigate current flooding, we also had to keep in mind that future flooding scenarios are likely to be more severe. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the site and some of the project constraints. So Grafius Run is a flashy stream, meaning that flooding occurs very quickly without much warning. This is due to the steep topography of the watersheds. And as briefly mentioned before, Grafius Run is a forked stream with two branches, which we'll refer to as the East Branch and the West Branch. Each branch has contributing drainage areas of approximately 1.5 square miles, and both branches of Grafius Run discharge to the city's storm sewer system at this location, where the water then flows under the city to the Hepburn Street pump station, at which points the water is pumped through the levee to the West Branch Susquehanna River. So to get into some of the project constraints that we've encountered, first, the capacity of the storm sewer system can't be upgraded to handle larger flows for a few different reasons. First, one of the biggest contributors to flooding is due to the debris clogs, which would still occur if the capacity of the system was increased, simply just due to the extent of debris that accumulate there. And then second, since flows from Grafius are discharged through a pump station, the pump station would need to be upgraded as well to accommodate this increase in flow, which would be very expensive, and the city doesn't have the funds to undertake a project of that size at this time. And then finally, upgrading the storm sewer system may have impacts to historic resources related to the Underground Railroad, which we'll discuss a little bit more on the next slide. But another project constraint is just the size of the drainage areas for Grafius Run. If we were to construct detention basins, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection would classify these dams as high hazard due to the size of the drainage areas exceeding 100 acres. The PEDEP requires the high hazard dams to safely pass the probable maximum flood, which is the largest flood that can be reasonably expected to occur in this region. And ultimately, this requirement increases the size of the basins that we would have to construct. And then the city also has limited financial resources, so selecting a less costly alternative would allow the city to implement the design sooner than if they had to apply for any outside financial assistance. And since Grafius Run is located in both the city of Williamsport and neighboring Loyalsock Township, municipal boundaries were another project constraint that we had to consider. The city preferred to keep any construction within city limits, but this did prove to be challenging when trying to develop the conceptual designs for detention basins. And then finally, there's a potential to impact historic resources related to the Underground Railroad, not just within the city's storm sewer system, but within the Grafius Run watershed as a whole. And we're going to get into that on the next slide. So, as mentioned, there are historic sites related to the Underground Railroad that can be found within the Grafius Run watersheds. And the Underground Railroad is an important part of American history. For those who don't know, the Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad, but it was a route to freedom. So African Americans who escaped slavery in the South traveled north in search of a free life, and due to being considered fugitives, they had to travel in secret. And anecdotally, the city's storm sewer system and caves along Freedom Road provided cover for those traveling the Underground Railroad. And this picture on the bottom shows the caves, which are located right next to the East Branch of Grafius Run. And in addition to the anecdotal reports of the sewers and caves' relation to the Underground Railroad, land donated by Daniel Hughes, who provided significant support to the Underground Railroad in Williamsport. It's now the location of the Freedom Road Cemetery, which contains the grave sites for 9 African American Civil War veterans. So overall, we had to consider any potential impacts that our proposed project would have on these historic sites. So now that we've provided some background and discussed the project constraints, we'll discuss in a little bit more detail some of the alternatives that were initially considered to help mitigate flooding along Grafius Run. The city contracted with WSP initially to design conceptual designs for detention basins along both the east and west branches of Grafius Run, and the intent was to hold the water within impoundments so that we could limit any flash flooding downstream. For the conceptual designs, we initially assumed that no excavation would be required for the basins, and the extent of the proposed impoundments was just based on the natural topography. We used geoprocessing techniques to determine basin characteristics for hydrology analyses, and then we used HydroCAD to determine the size of the proposed impoundments. We initially evaluated 3 different alternatives, which included constructing one large basin, 3 stepped basins, and then 1 basin with pumped outflow for each branch of Grafius Run. But after obtaining the results from the preliminary alternative analysis, WSP and the client realized that these initial alternatives might not be feasible for a variety of reasons, which we'll discuss later in the presentation. But before giving up on the idea of constructing detention basins, WSP developed another 4 alternatives to be analyzed. And these additional alternatives would include constructing one large detention basin, but instead of only passing the stream's base flows, it would pass larger storm events like the 10-year, 25-year, 50-year, and 100-year events. And while these additional alternatives won't limit as much water flowing to the inlets, it would provide some flow reduction as well as the opportunity to trap debris upstream. However, even with passing larger flows through the dams, the amount of land acquisition and the heights of the dams required would still be significant. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the preliminary alternatives, but for the sake of time, we're only going to focus on the initial 3 alternatives we had developed for the east branch of Grafius Run. So as we mentioned, alternative 1 includes constructing one large detention basin, and we initially designed this to only pass the stream's base flows, which is approximately equal to the 2-year storm event. And if we were to implement this alternative, it would require approximately 14 acres of land, and the dam would need to be 45 feet tall. This red outline in this figure shows the extent of the impoundment that would be needed, and this basically represents the land that would be inundated by water during a probable maximum flood event. So any people living in this area would need to be relocated in order to construct this alternative. And then the caves and cemetery that we mentioned earlier are located in this southern portion. So constructing a basin anywhere here would have impacts to that. So for alternative 2, this includes construction of 3 stepped basins, and these are just smaller impoundments that are along the length of the stream. We initially included this alternative in our analysis to see if there was a way to reduce the size of the impoundments, but this alternative actually requires the most amount of land, which totals to about 29 acres for all 3 impoundments. And then the dam heights would range between 20 and 40 feet. This alternative was also the most challenging to keep within city limits due to how far upstream the impoundments extend. And just like the last slide, the red lines in this figure show the extent of the 3 impoundments that would be required. So for the last preliminary alternative we'll talk about, alternative 3 includes one storage basin with pumped outflow. And like alternative 1, this dam will also pass flows that are equivalent to the 2-year event, but instead of containing all of the additional floodwater within the impoundment, almost 500 cubic feet per second would be pumped out to a receiving stream. And while this alternative would require the smallest amount of land acquisition, the pumps that would be needed would be very expensive, and pumping the water to a receiving stream would also require coordination with FEMA to pursue a letter of map revision, which would add additional costs and delays the schedule of the project. And this alternative would also still require a 20-foot high dam and the relocation of residents living along the stream. So now we'll discuss some of the major drawbacks associated with the preliminary alternatives. Due to the large size of these impoundments, this project would be very expensive, and the cost just for land acquisition would be over $1 million, which exceeds the city's budget. All of the alternatives would require permits from the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, Lycoming County, and Alternative 3 would also require coordination with FEMA. Since flooding from Grafius is frequent, the city ideally wanted to identify a solution that could be implemented within a reasonable time frame. And with all of these permits needed, it would have taken years for one of these alternatives to be constructed. And in addition to the high costs and permitting requirements, these dams would be considered high hazard, not just for the size of the drainage areas, but also due to them being directly upstream of the city. Any breach of these dams would result in an immediate risk of life and property. And then finally, the potential to impact historic resources would add additional permitting requirements, and this would further increase the cost and delay the schedule of the project. So with all that being said, we ultimately decided that the preliminary alternatives that were analyzed would not be feasible. So after discussions with the city, WSP proposed a new innovative solution that is not what the city initially intended, but it would help mitigate flooding at a reasonable cost and would be able to be implemented quickly and efficiently.
Now I'm going to go over the solution that we proposed. The methodology to help reduce the impact of flooding was to install sensors at various points of the stream, as shown in the bottom left image. Brad's experience was utilized to determine and communicate with the city how sensors could be used for Grafius Run. The sensors use pressure from water above to determine how high the water level is. Once a preset level is reached, an alert is sent out to the city. This lets on-call maintenance members know to go out to where areas of the stream are backlogged and clear out the debris as shown in the previous slide. The water height is set to a level that gives the on-call team at least a 30-minute heads up before water will reach the top of the bank. This is important because before sensors were installed, team members had to trek through some of the water, which is a safety concern and also makes it more difficult to clear out the debris. It is important to note that Williamsport owns the sensors, and the staff communicated how much time they need based on clearing the debris in the past. This method has been shown to be effective, had lower risk in the case of failure compared to structures, and had a lower cost to the city. Also, this method has no permit requirements and only requires property owner permission. The image to the right shows how the sensor receives solar power and gets signal to send the alerts. Three sensors were placed along the stream, two upstream and one closer to where the water enters the water system. Sensors had to be somewhere that was easily accessible, had low vegetation, cellular reception to be able to send the alerts, and sunlight since they are powered by solar panels. Water depths and alerts from past storms can be viewed online by WSP and the city, so data can be used for any other preventative measures. Sensors were proposed in spring of 2023 and installed of fall of 2023 with the delay caused by the backorder of the sensors. Here's an example storm event from last winter from the data collected by the sensors, which is only a few months after installation. As previously discussed, the topography where Grafius is makes high water levels appear quickly, as shown by the two spikes in the graph. A short time before these spikes was when maintenance members were alerted, and then a drop in the water level after the peak is when debris was cleared and full capacity flow was allowed again. This was able to be done before water flooded over the banks, making it more efficient and safer for the staff. This same trend, where quick rises and drops in water level, are shown in many storms as we look at data after major precipitation events. This backs up the effectiveness of using the sensors. A continuation of this project was to build a HEC HMS model to help inform the city if any future flood control designs are needed. The model will be calibrated every year for 3 years based on any new data collected from the sensors and rain gauges. The sensors will still be a viable method as precipitation patterns change and increase. They will also work no matter how frequent storm events are and will always send an alert to the on-call staff as long as they are working properly. Some key takeaways for this project are that a common approach to flooding issues is to build a structure. However, based on the specific details of the site, as well as important constraints for the client, as explained through the presentation, a lower cost and quick implementation but still effective method, like the sensors, was the best fit for the client. This is supported by the feedback from the client as well as data from the storm events. This drives the point as consultants, it's important to take consideration of all the parameters and do what's best to help the client with the issue they approach us with. Thank you everyone for attending this Snack and Learn, and we can go over the questions now.
Thank you, Christian and Kristen, for a fantastic presentation. I will just mention the housekeeping items again. The presentation slides are available to download in the materials tab as a PDF, and also please continue to log your questions in the question box. I will start with the first question. Since implementation, has the community identified other locations and uses to expand this warning system?
Yeah, so this past summer, the city was actually impacted by the remnants of Hurricane Debby, and they got a ton of rain, and many areas of the city did flood. So there is one specific area kind of on the southern portion of the city along Reach Road where the city is currently trying to see if installation of sensors would help mitigate any flood risks in that area.
And like I said earlier, since the city owns the sensors, they did purchase a few extra originally, which can then be used for additional projects like this.
Thank you. Are the sensors in still wells or in pipes at the bottom of the stream?
So the sensor, it's installed adjacent to the stream. The pressure portion of the sensor is what goes into the stream bed so that it can sense the water levels. And then the power source is located on like stakes adjacent to the stream. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but if there's anything else that we can provide, I can touch base with you after the presentation to discuss it.
Thank you. Another question here is why not installing a device to protect culverts from debris?
Yeah, so the culverts, they do have trash racks on them to prevent the debris from clogging inside the culvert. The problem is that the extent of the debris that accumulates is just so significant that it starts blocking up the trash racks so that the capacity of the culverts is reduced. So they do have devices to help prevent the debris clogs. The problem is that that debris still needs to get removed at some point. So that's why the city workers have to go out and remove the debris. Otherwise, the stream would overtop its banks eventually when the debris clogs gets too significant.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, the stream is very flashy, so the water level rises very quickly and brings a lot of debris on most storm events, which I guess would still clog the area.
Thank you. The next question is about cost. What is the difference in magnitude of the cost of traditional methods versus using the sensors?
So most traditional methods, such as like the building structures, are in the area of the millions, where using the sensors is around 100,000. Obviously, that price changes depending on how many sensors you would need.
Yeah, so for this project, the city spent about 100,000 altogether on installing the sensors and all of the coordination that went with that. And that $100,000 also included a couple backup sensors. So if one of the sensors that we installed stops working or needs to get replaced, they already have that backup that they can go put out there themselves. So in addition to the initial costs associated with these projects, the maintenance cost for sensor installation is also fairly low.
Thank you. Are there any plans to safeguard the sensors from environmental factors or theft?
That's a great question. I don't know if theft was necessarily considered. We did have to get property owner permission to install them there. So there's most likely an understanding of like where it is and who has access to it. But that is a great question that I can look into more and reach out after the presentation. As far as environmental factors go, the biggest risk to the sensors would be flooding. We actually did have one of the sensors get knocked over during a storm event. So when the city goes to fix that and put it back up, we're going to have to look at some ways that we can kind of strengthen um, the way that it's installed along the stream so that we don't have them getting knocked over during flood events.
Yeah, and to touch on the theft, since they are on private property, they're not readily accessible to the public, and many of the property owners and neighbors of the property owners are happy to have the sensors there to help mitigate flooding on their properties.
Thank you. Does the power source have battery in addition to the solar panel?
Christian, I'll let you try and answer this one.
No, they don't have a battery in addition. They are just used by solar panels.
Thank you. Is the system alert suitable for underdeveloped countries to work with?
Yeah, as mentioned, they just use cellular reception and solar power. So as long as they have those two parameters to be able to use and the lower costs, so they could be suitable for underdeveloped nations.
Yeah, I would just add as long as there's a need where flood warning is necessary, I think these sensors would be great for underdeveloped nations, especially considering the costs, and we don't have to construct huge expensive projects. So like Christian said, as long as there's adequate cellular reception and sunlight for the solar panels, it would be a great option.
Thank you. I will take the last question, even though we received so many questions. So all the additional questions that we didn't cover will be answered directly with the presenters. The last question is, what notification does the system send? So what notification system do the sensors report?
Is the question asking like what system or like what website we're using for the sensors, or like how the alerts are given? Because Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the city gets text messages and email alerts when the sensors are triggered. Is that correct?
Yes, they get texts and emails, and they also get, if you want like the parameters, they get the depth and rate of change as well as date and time of when things are occurring. And also all the data can be previewed on a website after storm events if people wanted to see what happened throughout the whole storm.
Fantastic. Thank you for clarifying this. So looks like we're at the end of our time today. So thank you again, Christian and Kristen, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you for submitting all your questions. We will reach out to you later with all the answers. And again, we hope to see you in our upcoming session. So we will wrap up the session now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.